Reading the title, you probably know what you are getting into. I will present how Vladimir Putin's interview pushes a certain viewpoint through the careful usage of language, how the overall message is not simply a sum of the individual statements, but through the context within the whole interview and with the context of other media narratives outside of this interview that are referenced within, additional messages are conveyed. The problem with this kind of propaganda is that it is easy to pick up the message, but if you try to refute it, you may fall into the trap of trying to discredit single points. Some points may be true, some points require extensive research, especially if it involves more than 1,000 years of history. Some points, as short as a single sentence, may contain a secondary assertion, and if you are distracted and try to discredit the primary assertion, even if you succeed, the secondary assertion still contributes to the overall message. For these reasons, I will not review the truthfulness of the historic events presented by Vladimir Putin, as it would probably take months to do it with the necessary due diligence, and there are people who are better equipped to do so. I will also not focus on individual assertions or claims so much. I will explain some fallacies used, if there are any, but my main focus will be on what the overarching message of the interview is and how it is conveyed between the lines. Important to mention before I start that I did not find any information who was translating Vladimir Putin's speech into English during the interview. The audio quality is quite high and sounds professional. I am bad at picking up accents, but he sounds Russian, so he could be a Kremlin-provided translator. However, on the official Kremlin website, a different translator is used, so ultimately, I do not know if this is a Kremlin-provided translator who is deliberate in his wording, or someone hired by Tucker Carlson who just did a very good job focusing on the nuances, or maybe he expressed himself in a way that can be easily misinterpreted. Regardless, the overarching message is still present, so let's get into it. The interview starts off by Tucker Carlson asking the obvious question: what are the reasons that started off the current situation? Instead of answering, Vladimir Putin began explaining the history of Russia and Ukraine as he understands it. Whether this interpretation of history is correct or not, I will not judge. Vladimir Putin starts off by saying there were two centers of power, Kyiv and Novgorod, and the former began gravitating towards Lithuania. He already refers to Kyiv and the surrounding area as southern parts of Russia. He also mentions that the Duchy of Lithuania was also called the Russian-Lithuanian Duchy because of the sizable Russian population. This is an example of a claim where there are two assertions, the primary one being the name of the duchy itself, the secondary being the size of the Russian population. The size of the Russian population is not the main point he tries to convey. The emphasis is on him referring to them as Russians, not as Ukrainians and not as any other Slavic group of people. Basically, by saying that the duchy was called Russian-Lithuanian Duchy, he tries to convey the message that Ukraine or Ukrainians did not exist at the time. He continues saying that later Poles exerted cultural dominance over the people living in the territory, forcing Polish language on Russians as he claims, and trying to create the idea of a new ethnic group. Now less subtly claiming that Ukrainians were originally Russians and developed their own identity due to external forces. Some might dispute this claim, falling directly into the trap set out. Whether or not the Ukrainian identity was forcefully or artificially created is irrelevant, as the Ukrainians recognize themselves as a separate ethnic group. And this previous point I made is again irrelevant, as it gives no reason for Russia to invade Ukraine. No more than for the United Kingdom to invade the USA, or for Germany to invade Austria. But if it did, then why should Ukraine be incorporated into Russia and not the other way around? Despite several attempts by Tucker Carlson to ask how this is relevant, Vladimir Putin evades the question, does not directly state his reasons. He lets the audience jump to conclusion based on his implied, indirect arguments. He follows up by claims that Poles treated this group of people harshly, and that the people who were in control of the authority of these Russian lands requested Russian rulers and Orthodox priests from the Polish authority. He again refers to these lands as Russian, but by this time you are probably starting to notice it and doesn't need another explanation why he does it. He continues on that after the refusal of the Poles, they appealed to Moscow to be ruled over, and so Moscow took them away, and then a subsequent war followed. He does not cite it as the reason for current events, but this segment of history lesson parallels the current Kremlin narrative, according to which Russia is protecting the rights of Russians living in Ukraine, and that the rulers of these 5 Ukrainian oblasts requested to join Russia themselves, following the respective election results. And now there is a war, or a special military operation, as he calls it, mirroring the one fought with the Poles. And just like the old war, the current war is not against the Ukrainians, but against the collective West, in order to protect the people of Ukraine. He follows up by stating that Austria relied on Ukrainization, preparing for the First World War, in order to weaken Russia, their future enemy. You probably understood this segment after previous similar segments, trying to convince people that Ukrainians as a separate ethnic group do not exist and were artificially created. If you paid more attention and are familiar with Kremlin propaganda, you probably also realize that this segment tries to draw a historic parallel and imply that the West is trying to weaken and then attack Russia, implying that the current support for Ukraine from the West is not for the benefit of Ukraine, but rather simply using Ukraine and the Ukrainian people to weaken Russia before an upcoming attack. This is a question that the interview started out with, and rather than giving a direct answer that runs the risk of being countered by exposing logical fallacies or just simple lies, this method indirectly pushes the same message. And if you don't understand what is happening and simply try to check whether or not this statement about the Austrian tactics is correct or not, it could very well be that Austria indeed employed these tactics, and now this fact could be used to push the narrative that the same thing is happening again, using this as a proof despite the lack of connection between the two events. The better case is that you just waste your time by fact-checking irrelevant historical events without realizing the fallacious argumentation, or the lack thereof, as this segment relies more on people jumping to conclusions than actual arguments. He continues by stating that theories of Ukrainian independence appeared, but all of them called for Ukraine and Russia to have good relations. The statement is vague and its purpose is not to inform. He is trying to set up an implied argument that Russia was wronged or betrayed, implying that Ukraine gained independence, but the relationship between the two countries is now bad. On its own, this would be a very weak argument, but later on, he leans in heavily on deals broken by the United States or the West. And with that in context, it is easy to understand this segment as Ukraine gained independence, but then had a bad relationship with Russia, and then you can jump to a conclusion without any logical connection that since Ukraine did not hold up their end of this alleged deal, Russia can revoke Ukrainian independence. Later he refers to the era before the Second World War, when Poland had received land from Russia after the end of the first one. Later, when Hitler requested the territories back as historic German land, Poland refused, and as he says, by this the Poles pushed Hitler to attack. The question could arise, how is this relevant to the reasons that Russia attacked Ukraine? Well, you are not paying attention. We are talking about the history of Ukraine and Russia. The same question could still arise, how is this relevant to Ukrainian and Russian history? It's not. It serves to justify current attacks, implying that since Ukraine did not and does not give back historic Russian lands, Russia is justified to attack. He follows up by directly stating that Ukraine was created around 1920 when the USSR established it as a Soviet republic and that it has never existed before. He also says that Russia and the USSR are the same, or to be more precise, he says something along the line of Russia was called the USSR back then. He also says that Vladimir Putin transferred lands and people living on these lands to Ukraine that had never belonged to it, again emphasizing and claiming that Ukraine did not exist before. This later will be tied into a claim that it is an artificial state. He continues by claiming that the USSR engaged in Ukrainization and arguing that it was not because several leaders of the USSR came from this region, but because of the general policy of indigenization, promoting national languages and cultures. I think with this point he further tries to push the message that the Ukrainian ethnicity or culture is not real, but is rather artificially created. But the way he puts it makes it sound like that the Ukrainian ethnicity and culture already existed and the Soviet Union recognized it and supported it. This contradicts his point that Ukrainians as a separate ethnicity or culture do not exist. He then refers to territorial transfers from Poland, Hungary and Romania to Ukraine. As he puts it, in this sense Ukraine is an artificial state, further legitimizing the existence of Ukraine as an independent state. He also emphasized that these transferred lands are still part of Ukraine today, then goes on about an anecdote where he visited Berehove or Bereksas. He says the city name was displayed in Russian and Hungarian, but not in Ukrainian, again suggesting that Ukrainians as an ethnic group do not exist, but are in fact Russians, which is contradicted by his previous point. But he also follows up by mentioning seeing Hungarians, and in a conversation none of his acquaintances saying that Hungarians are living here because this is their land. This message is probably aimed at the group of Hungarians who are supporting him, trying to gain more support and sympathy. He also says that, I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there wanted to get back to their historical land. This is probably also aimed at Hungarian sympathizers, but at the same time parallels a claim that the people living in the 5 oblasts, or just generally in Ukraine, want to join Russia. He also makes a single word reference to having Hungarian rights infringed, a reference to Orbán Viktor's claim, an appeal to Hungarian sympathizers. But it also provides the Kremlin narrative that the Ukrainian government infringes on the rights of Russians. During this segment, and in general during the entire interview, he is also avoiding any questions, monologuing his well-prepared narrative. He continues by saying that upon the breakup of the Soviet Union, everything generously bestowed upon Ukraine was dragged away by the latter. Here he could directly state that he thinks this was unjust or unlawful and therefore these lands belong to Russia, but he stops short of that. This sentence implies this justification, and a group of people will understand it as such, but at the same time he cannot be called out for this statement because he never makes such a statement directly, but still gets his message across. He closes out the history segment by saying that he suspects the Russian leadership who initiated the breakup of the USSR thought everything would be fine, because the relationship between Ukraine and Russia was based on a common language, as more than 90% of the population spoke Russian. Whether this is Russian as a primary or secondary language is unclear in the statement, but in the context of previous points aimed at denying the existence of Ukrainians as a separate ethnic or cultural group, this point can be interpreted similarly. He continues by mentioning family ties, friendships, common culture, common history, again implying Ukrainians are Russians, finally common fate, coexistence within a single state for centuries, and deeply interconnected economies. He claims all of these made a good relationship inevitable. This implies that the current bad relationship is not natural, but rather was artificially created by external forces, not by Ukrainians or Russians. Following this, he starts talking about more modern topics and NATO, that I will leave for another video. I also recommend watching the original interview. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. I also hope that now you know how a message can be conveyed to an audience without directly stating it. Until next time.